Hey guys, Yuliya here. So in this video, I'm going to talk about all the plants that I grew from seed last year. And I grew almost 50 different varieties. So this video will probably end up being very long, or I may have to cut it in half and post it in two different parts. We'll see, I'm not sure yet. But I want to preface this video with this information. Majority of these plants require a full sun type situation in the garden, which I do not have. There is a small spot in the garden, it's about 3 feet by 10 feet in the devil strip, that receives anywhere from 6 to 7 hours of sunlight per day. And that is as close to full sun situation as it gets in this garden. In fact, I will post satellite image from Google Maps of what our garden looks like in the summer. And you could see a lot of 100-year-old shade trees that cast shadows that are very long and very big. So our garden is mostly shade. And I'm telling you this because these plants that do require full sun situation and are planted in pretty much what is a part shade situation do not bloom as profusely as if they were planted in a full sun situation. So don't judge by the amount of flowers. And that was actually the reason I wanted to plant them, is just to see the flowers. I wasn't interested in the number of blooms, but I was just curious to see what they actually look like, because most of these plants I've never grown before. So I separated this video in kind of 3 parts. The first part is plants that I grew using winter sowing method. The second part is plants that I started inside the house. And the third part is some of the plants that seed freely in my garden. So let's just dive into it. All right, so here's the list of all of the plants that I grew last year, but the ones that are highlighted, I grew using winter sowing method. So I will start with Bachelor's Button Blue Boy. And normally you would start Bachelor's Button direct sowing, either early in the spring, or you can also start them early in the fall, so they overwinter and they bloom very early in the spring. However, they did great winter sowing too. And when they started blooming, that blue was unreal. It is the purest of blues I've ever seen in a flower. It was just so beautiful. I'm a huge fan of meadow-like flowers. It was a huge pollinator attractant, and I think it fit in the garden really well. Again, I planted it in an area where it did not receive a lot of light. I'd say this spot received under 4 hours of light, and they still kind of did okay. They actually do great as a cut flower and just look great in the garden too. The next flower is a Columbine Rocky Mountain Blue. And Columbines are perennials, although short-lived. They do benefit from stratification, which means a cold treatment before they germinate. They started beautifully in the bottles. I mean, they were so cute and healthy. So I planted them out in the garden around June time. Tragedy struck and they were all destroyed by bunnies. I had such high hopes for those plants, for that beautiful blue color, and I just love the texture of the rosettes too, even without them blooming. So I cannot tell you about my experience with those, but I'm trying those again. The next one is Cosmos Double Click. And this is double Cosmos. I really love the structure of the flower. The colors are in this like pink, light pink, white palette. I also love that they are much shorter than your usual Cosmos, because Cosmos tend to flop all over in the garden. And once they flop, even if you stake them back, they never look the same. They just look crooked. So these were great. They're sort of short-lived because mildew affects them big time in my area because we have high humidity, but I loved them while I had them. Next one is Delphinium Pacific Giants. And I dream of a day when I can grow a Delphinium in this area, because they're just these dreamy, absolutely gorgeous plants. They add that tall structure into your garden like nothing else. But I don't think that day will ever come, because every time I plant them, either from seed or as a perennial, they perish and they just melt in our humidity and hot summer air. These did not even germinate. And I started them earlier in January because delphiniums also benefit from stratification, but nothing happened. The next plant is Blue Grama grass, and I love those. I've seen them sold in nurseries. I also have seen them planted as mass in lots of botanical gardens or public spaces that sort of geared toward native plants. This is a native grass. The flower or inflorescence on this grass looks like an eyelash. It is the cutest thing. Lots of them germinated. I actually had to give some away to my garden friends. They were happy to have them. But I planted them out in our front yard garden, and a few weeks later, they were pulled out by our lawn contractor. So we hire a contractor to mow our lawn, and they sometimes try to do some weeding, and they think that a lot of plants that I plant in my garden are weeds, which they certainly look like when they're at a young stage of their development. So I think I have about 3 left, and they did bloom last year, just a little bit, but I think it will take time to establish for them to bloom profusely, and I can't wait to see that. So I have a few left. I may start some more again because I have some seeds left. I love those tufts of grasses and that beautiful texture, like see-through texture, is awesome. The next one is a Hollyhock Outhouse. And hollyhocks are also one of those plants that are very difficult to grow in our area because they get rust, which is one of the fungi that thrives in humid environment that we have here. Now, hollyhocks are generally biannual, which means they grow the first year and develop, and then they bloom the following year. This one bloomed the same year. It developed this beautiful giant rosette already in the bottles, and then I planted it out, and guess what? By July time, I had a beautiful stalk of hollyhock flowers, which I've never grown before here in this area. So I will definitely be repeating this one. However, it did succumb to rust later in the season. Unfortunately, I did not spray for it, but it's okay. If I can start it from seed this year and have it bloom again, it's not a big deal. The next plants are Love in the Mist, Chocolate and Cream, or Nigella. And Nigella is another one of those plants like the Bachelor's button that you can direct sow in the garden, either early spring or early fall, and they will just grow and bloom beautifully. But I tried winter sowing them because we actually have a lot of slug issues, and that's what happens with young seedlings. If you direct sow them in the garden, slugs just devour them, or rabbits. But if you do it in the winter sowing containers, nothing will get inside, and at least you will get them to that mature stage where they can withstand some damage. And that's why I was, for the first time ever, successful with Nigella, because every time I would direct sow them, they would just be destroyed. They were beautiful. It's a beautiful color, although I think next year or this year I will just grow a blue one. The next one is Orlaya White Lace, and Orlayas are one of those flowers like Queen's Anne's lace with the flat top flowers, but this one is not a nuisance cedar like the Queen's Anne's lace would be. And I just love that it's a little bit bulkier of a flower. It is very low maintenance. It's a great cut flower. I will definitely be repeating this one. Where I planted it, again, it did not have enough light, so it did not perform as great. The next group of plants I grew were poppies, and poppies are sort of notorious for being difficult to grow, and I never had luck with them until I tried winter sowing them. And the ones that I tried last year were Hungarian Blue, the Lawrence Grape, and Amazing Gray. And Hungarian blue and Lawrence grape sort of looked similar. There was a subtle difference in the color, but the foliage was amazing. That powdery blue color, like juicy, large leaves, and then the flowers that were like violet purple, and then you have the seed pods that are incredibly decorative. So the amazing gray poppy, however, blew my mind. Guys, the hype is real. Amazing gray poppy is something outworldly. It's opens up with a true gray color, and then it pales to a lighter gray. And the texture of the petals and the color is just so unusual, not something I've ever seen in the plant. So I'm definitely trying this one again, because I only grew 3 plants last year because I didn't know how they were going to perform, and they underperformed for sure, again, because there was not enough light and they did not reach their full height or full potential. So I want to try them again. The next plant is a Nicotiana Langsdorffii, and that's the one that I was planting out in the front yard in one of the videos in the spring last year. I love Nicotianas because they're very easy to grow. They have this ethereal sort of texture that go great with everything. And this one had that lime color. And the bed where I planted it in the front had a lot of hot colors, so that color actually cooled everything down. It's a huge pollinator attractant. Hummingbirds love it. And it started to sort of turn into mush in the middle of the summer because of our heat. And I was about to pull it out, but then I decided to just cut it down to the ground and see what happened. And it regrew beautifully. It bloomed even better than the first time around. So definitely a plant to try. And I actually am going to try more Nicotianas in the garden this year. I want to try more of the white variety and the pink ones. So the next 3 are perennials that I started a winter sowing. And the thing about when you start perennials from seed, it takes anywhere from 1 year to 3 years or more before you see any blooms. So the first one is a Penstemon Fragrant Palmers. Grew beautifully, germinated beautifully. I planted out in the garden. Not sure when I will see any blooms. The next one is Penstemon Rocky Mountain Blue. Also no flowers, but healthy rosettes, no problem. And Coneflower Pale Purple, which also formed beautiful rosettes. And it was just so wonderful to start many perennials from seed and plant them out in the garden. I think most of these are native too. And I think the Coneflower will bloom this year because I saw sort of a flower forming last year, but it got really cold and it kind of seized. The next plant is amazing. This is a Larkspur Fancy Blue Purple, and this is the 2nd year I was growing it. The color on that thing is indescribable. It's like that blue, purple, cobalt, sort of sparkly, really hard to photograph color. But you have to try this. If you're into cooler colors, it is just like nothing else. They're very easy to grow. You can direct sow them. Again, I've winter sowed them for 2 years. They were very successful, bloomed beautifully, performed great in bouquets. I would like to try even more Larkspurs. They had no problem with our heat and humidity. They're sort of short-lived annual, and they bloom out at some point and start to form seed pods. At that point, they're pretty much done. But those performed beautifully. The next plant I've never heard of before, and it is Silene Sibella Carmine. It is the cutest thing. And the Select Seeds company that sells these seeds, they actually show it in the hanging baskets. And that, I think, is the place where they would do best because they're a very short plant and they're sort of cascading. I did not have a spot to put a hanging basket in my garden, so guess what I did? I just cut the winter sowing container and I plopped them out in the devil strip, and I forgot to plant them. And they were there for a month and a half in a winter sowing container, blooming their heads off. It was the most amazing thing. And after they stopped blooming, they formed these coolest seed pods that look like balloons. And I can see them being more like a ground cover, maybe in a rockery or a rock garden or a raised bed or a hanging basket or a window box. Those were just amazing. I'm definitely growing them again. And maybe like if you have a balcony or a terrace, they bloom for a very long time. I forgot to mention this poppy. This one is Oriental Royal Wedding, and it is a perennial poppy, and it germinated beautifully in the winter sowing bottles, and I planted it out in the container despite the fact of them not liking root disturbance. It was fine. It grew beautifully. It formed these kind of prickly leaves. So maybe this year I will see some blooms. The next flower, which is an evening scented stock, is a no for me. So I expected this flower to be this like meadowy looking, lots of fragrance flower, and it just didn't do any of those things. It didn't have a great scent. It looked really scraggly most of the summer. So I don't know if that's because I don't have enough light in my garden, or it's just the way this plant looks. Now, the seeds of this plant, which is Snow on the Mountain, I got from a friend of mine, and Snow on the Mountain is a reseeder in the garden. I don't think it's an aggressive one, but it definitely reseeds, so keep that in mind. So this year I decided to try it, and it was beautiful. It actually got a lot of attention in the garden, and the one thing, I forgot to collect the seeds myself, so I am hoping that it could reseed in the garden so I could see it again, because it definitely is a repeat plant for me. All right, so this plant here is a Rose of Heaven, and I could see this being a huge success in a rock garden or maybe a raised rock bed with a dry soil and a sunny condition. Unfortunately, again, I planted it in the place where it did not get enough sun exposure. So it had like these sporadic flowers. When I looked it up online and I saw the full potential of this plant, I was blown away. It is a very prolific bloomer, and those beautiful meadow-like little flowers just cover the plant. So if maybe one day I get a full sun situation, I will grow this plant again, but I don't think I can grow it right now in my garden conditions. I grew 2 alyssums using a winter sowing method, and they grow beautifully in those bottles. So I grew Oriental Nights and Carpet of Snow. And by the time I opened the bottles, most of them were blooming already, which is amazing, because if you direct sow alyssum, I probably would not see the blooms until end of May, but at that point they were blooming at the end of April. So what I like about alyssum from seed is that they have this more looser habit than the ones that you buy in a nursery that have those little clumps of flowers. The Oriental Nights have a little bit of a purple tinge to it, and Carpet of Snow obviously is white, but both of them are absolutely beautiful. Tall Verbena, or Verbena bonariensis, usually reseeds in my area. So for example, a friend of mine who lives about a mile away from me has hers reseed all the time. Mine never do. So I have to start them from seed every year, and they do great winter sowing. So you have to be careful with Verbena bonariensis if you live in a warmer climate, because they can get really aggressive and seed all over the place. They are beautiful though. That purple color and that see-through texture, they go pretty much with everything. Just a beautiful plant. Definitely repeating it this year, or maybe because we're having a very mild winter, I will have some in the garden. Now, the last plant that I grew winter sowing was kind of a surprise, because it was a delphinium. And as I mentioned before, that delphiniums are incredibly hard to grow in our area. But this one, not only did it germinate and grew in a beautiful plant, it also bloomed. It didn't bloom for a long time or lived for a long time, but I got to see a bloom for the first time in my own garden of a delphinium, which is so worth it. So I actually may try this one again because it was not as susceptible to our humidity because it lived for probably 6 months in our area. So I have high hopes for it. Maybe if we have a cooler summer than usual, it may even do better. All right, you guys, this is it for this part of the video because as I was talking, I realized just how long this video is. So I will be separating it in 2 parts. So this one will be all the plants that I grew from seeds using winter sowing method. And in the second part, I will be talking about all the plants that I grew from seed that I started at home and the ones that reseed in my garden. Anyway, thank you so much, you guys, for watching. I hope you learned something new in this video, and I will see you in the next one. Bye. Oh, that's much better. Before I start, Mike is printing something. Great. Work from home life. Great. Larkspur purple.